Would you like to look for the biases in your internet searches when you're doing research online? Well, if you are, let's eat the frog. Now, maybe you're not familiar with that expression, but I'll modernize it just a tad by saying if you can remember these reality TV shows where you get something really good as a reward for doing something kind of really bad. One of them might be some Wagyu steak, some A5 grade Wagyu. I think I said that right. It's the most expensive steak in the world, and it may be $100 or more per ounce. Beautifully marbled, wonderful stuff. Or maybe that's not your thing. Maybe you're something else where you have some wonderful organic asparagus with extra virgin olive oil and hand cultured rosemary or something like that, fresh sea salt, pink sea salt or something like that. Whatever it is, that is a good thing for you. But the first thing you got to do is eat a frog. Most of us wouldn't consider eating a frog very good. Even if it's a Monty Python, Wizzo chocolate company, dead crunchy frog, chocolate covered dead crunchy frog, we wouldn't consider that good either. It's just something. So the point of the expression eat the frog is you do something ugly up front. So what do you say we get to some definitions? There are different types of biases we could talk about. Modeling and statistics has their own. We have some like the oversample, undersample, and of course the confounding variables. But we're going to look at some cognitive biases. That's thinking type biases of how we process information. And the first one starts with the letter A, and we're just going to call it the affinity bias. And the affinity bias is what it sounds like. We gravitate toward people like ourselves in appearance, beliefs, and background, and we may avoid or even dislike people who are different from us. That's sort of the bubble bias. We like people like ourselves. I don't mean to go all yes on you, but don't surround yourself with yourself. Now, the confirmation bias is probably a big one for a lot of people, and it's defined as the tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information that confirms or supports one's prior beliefs or values. It is an important type of cognitive bias that it has a significant effect on the proper functioning of society by distorting evidence-based decision making. Now the next one may also be troublesome for some, called the bandwagon effect or the bandwagon bias. The bandwagon effect is a cognitive bias that causes people to think or act in a certain way because they believe that others are doing the same. For example, the bandwagon effect can cause someone to adopt a certain political ideology simply because an influential person in their social circle has adopted the same ideology. They're on the bandwagon. Now, the last one we're going to talk about is the anchor bias. And I call this one, don't change my mind with facts because it's already made up. Now, anchoring or focalism is a cognitive bias where an individual depends too heavily on an initial piece of information offered. It's considered to be the anchor to make subsequent judgments during decision making. Once the anchor is set, future negotiation arguments and estimates are hard to move from that point. Well, what do you say we go open some tabs and do some basic research like any person sitting at their desk at night or at their laptop, looking stuff up on the internet, see if we can see any of these biases, these four cognitive primary biases that we looked at. Let's go see if we can see any in some real life. And I got the first one I want to look at. I got the first article I pull up is actually by the Washington Post, and I'm going to come over here, the Washington Post. Now, I personally perceive the Washington Post as left-leaning and a little bit on the negative side. There's another type of bias out there, the frequency effect or the Baader-Meinhof, I think that's called. that says basically when you focus on something, you increase the frequency which you observe it at. If you're looking for a new Harley motorcycle, all of a sudden that's all you see all over the road is a new Harley. If you're looking for a new trendy set of shoes or whatever, all of a sudden everybody's got them but you. It's the frequency effect. And it's a type of bias. So I'm going to look at some other types of biases here to see if my perception bias is true. Now, I see Washington Post as left-leaning and a little bit on the negative side. And I would say that because they tend to want to repeat a lot of the bad stuff that we need to improve on. It's not that we're great, we're doing good in so many things. They'll have a lot of the isms and the shortfalls, and they'll just keep seeing them all over the place. And that's why I perceive them to be a little bit on the negative side. I might be wrong, and someone who disagrees with me might be right. Now let's look at this again. Now, even up at the top, right up here at the top, the Washington Post, their motto is "Democracy dies in darkness." Well, I'm not starting off too darn chipper right off the bat, am I? Well, the title for this, down here at the bottom, is "Millennials' Share of the U.S. Housing Market Small and Shrinking." Is that feeling particularly rosy and cheerful? What about this line? "Because home ownership is the chief builder of wealth, the trend is bad news for the economy." Does that feel like good news? Again, it's just my perception that they tend to be, that liberals tend to dwell on the negative instead of the positive, but I could be wrong. And I don't even know if this is left-leaning or not. So we could ask the internet. Now, the internet is the keeper of all information, and the internet can't be wrong and all that. So everything you read, you need to take with a grain of salt. But you can certainly ask and search for certain things like, what is the bias of a certain publication? Let's look. I happen to have a tab up here. Here's the Brookings. I'm going to change that back to Washington Post. If I got to spell Washington correctly, I got to type it right, and I'm going to do bias. All right. It says, "We have checked and found no evidence." Well, that one's Washington. That's Washington Post itself. So that might be asking me if I'm fluffy or not. Let's look at a little different search. All right, Wikipedia says, let's see. Here we go. All sides. This, I think, is a fairly reasonable site. Washington Post media bias, all sides. The Washington Post was giving a lean left bias rating that all sides is highly confident about. Originally established in 1877, blah, blah, blah. So we asked Washington Post. Washington Post says, no, we're not biased, but maybe a third party may think they are. So you can take that with a grain of salt. Now let's go ahead and look to see if we find some other type. Let's look for this top sentence. "Today's young adults are starting their lives on drastically different financial footing than their parents did a decade ago. They pay more for such necessities as food and housing, as wages have flattened, leaving many young families to incur mountains of debt and limited path for growing wealth." You know, again, I ask you, does that seem like a positive or negative kind of right off the bat sentence? I mean, I'm just asking. I'm not picking on anything. But let's look at, we're going to look for some of this. We have a link here. It says wages have flattened. I'm looking for some affinity bias. And it shows a real ugly looking chart that we're doing really good from 1960 toward 1970, and all of a sudden everything just looks horrible and it's going across and all that. Well, that may be very good data, and I'm not going to analyze this particular one at this time, but I want to look at who the Economic Policy Institute is. So let's go up here and ask Mr. Internet. Economic Policy Institute bias, and it says, the review says that it is left-leaning through political affiliation with labor and redistributive economic policies. So it's a leftist Marxist organization because they're doing redistribution. So that's an affinity bias with our already left-leaning thing. Now, let's look at our man himself. Our author is Christopher Ingram, handsome guy. Let's pull his little bio up. Let's click him up. It says he's a reporter covering all things data, education, Cornell University, BA in religious studies. Now, my son just recently graduated his master's degree from Cornell. It's a good school. I like Cornell. I don't have anything wrong with that. Now, I'm kind of looking at this right here, a BA in religious studies, and I'm kind of wondering, how that BA in religious studies fits in with my economic policies and that kind of stuff. I'm not saying it's off target, but I'm just kind of wondering how that fits in with it. But now our line underneath is Christopher Ingram writes about all things data with a particular interest in gun policy and drug policy. He previously worked at the Brookings Institution and the Pew Research Center. So gun policy and drug policy, that sounds leftist. Let's see who this Brookings Institution is, because it says he previously worked at the Brookings Institution. Let's come up here, ask Mr. Internet. And again, I'm not running anything down. I'm just trying to identify the affinity bias. And it says the Washington Post has described the Brookings as centrist and liberal. So we're left-leaning again. The LA Times has described the Brookings Institute, the Brookings, as liberal-leaning with a centrist before opining that such labels doesn't matter. Well, okay, there you go. So I think we can show that we have a lot of different biases going on in this one little piece. And the first thing is Mr. Christopher Ingram. Actually, he's from Minnesota, which is also a very blue state. So we're just starting to put some things together. We're not saying the information is bad, but we're building ourselves a little bit of our grain of salt. And he says that millennials share the U.S. housing market is small and shrinking. And he said this in January 20 of 2020. And if you remember, about that time is when we're having the greatest economic expansion in our history. We have unemployments at all-time lows, and that's among all groups. We have it among all working class. We have it against black unemployment, against Hispanic unemployment. You name the type of unemployment, it's at all-time low. And what happens with supply and demand when you have a lot of need for it and a few people to fill it? You get higher wages. But what he's opining here, with wages have flattened, is that coming up here, we're still not making any money. It's good flat. And we got good times going on right there. Now, I think I'm going to kill a couple of these tabs off at the top that's off your screen. Let's look at, remember he said they're going to get worse. Let's slide down here. I think we talked about, we haven't read this yet. Because millennials are entering their prime home buying years, the gap will probably narrow by the time they're 35, but not likely to reach 30% of the housing market or even 20% attained by the smaller Gen X at the same point in their lives. And he talks about, remember those numbers, 20 and 30%. And according to NBC, who I observe, in my opinion, to be a little bit still left, but pretty more closer to the central than WAPO. Its title says in this article, millennials are prepared to buy the most houses this year, and this is how they can prepare for it. And is this some massively different point in time? It says published Tuesday, February for 2020. So we're just a couple of weeks away from the WAPO article, and we get two very different opinions on this. WAPO says it's shrinking and it's getting terrible, and we'll likely not hit 30%. And we're looking over here, and that may be of the total percentage of real estate held, but it's opining disaster and terrible days. NBC, which is not an uber right type of publication, says millennials are projected to buy the most houses in 2020. And this is pre-coronavirus. And what was happening in the course beginning before coronavirus hit? Great wages. And, we were making some grounds. And it has a nice, lovely little chart right here. And the big one is millennials right there is the pink, 51%. So it's saying NBC thinks that millennials are going to buy over half the houses, half the residences in the United States in 2020. Now, again, these are dated about the same time, so we're not getting some post-Rona effect. We are actually seeing publications about the same time, and I think we discussed the affinity bias. Now we're going to talk about some additional. Let's hit the bandwagon bias, shall we? Now we've looked at affinity bias. Let's look at bandwagon bias. And to do the bandwagon bias, I need to tell you what the bandwagon is. And the bandwagon is 15-year-old worth data that says that people want to live in the big urban model. They want to live in the city. They want to have smaller families and smaller properties that we don't have to mow grass. And we like our condos and near our centers of interest and all that lovely stuff. So the question is, where are we going to get our information from as it happens? Google, Android, and Alphabet decided on that last Android update that forced the COVID tracker on me. They decided I needed to see this story. And this is from the Daily Wildcat, published down here September 1st, 2020. And the title of this particular piece is University of Arizona Professor Predicts the Great Senior Short Sale Will Upheave the Housing Market. The summary is the University of Arizona College of Architecture, Planning and Landscape Architecture Professor Arthur Nelson predicts the future of the housing market and unsellable homes in a 2020 study. All right, now I just have to tell you, I'm not buying it. Our population, I haven't seen a net decrease in humans in Earth on my United States. The population grows, and the only way I see a great deal of unsellable homes, something that's not in his study. So, we're going to look at the bandwagon. The bandwagon is going to be a leaning towards the urban model and how great the city is and how bad the suburbs are. However, we know for a fact that when cities grow, if they're able to, they move into the suburbs and they annex the suburbs, and the suburbs become part of the city. And if they don't like the houses, they tear them down and build a taller one on top of them to pack in that tax base. That's what they do. Now, New York and Boston and some of the others that are kind of physically bound already because they've already spread. But in general, cities are like mold on bread. They spread from the center out. That's just what they do. And the question is, why are we going to change that? He's looking at some old data. Let's go back. Now, that's what he says. We're going to have a glut of houses. Now, the summary is a study from the University of Arizona professor of College of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape Architecture predicts that millions of homes owned by baby boomers and Gen Zers will become unsellable due to the demographic and preferential shifts among millennials and Gen Zers in the next couple of decades. Not thinking it's going to happen. But let's see what he thinks is going to happen. We start out with what are we talking about on the paper, and Daily Wildcat says, would you be able to summarize for me in layman's terms what the study shows? And he starts talking about the different generations. Now remember, a generation pretty well much designed, you can probably think about it as mom and dad and the kids and the grandkids, these, generation like you would your family. So he comes down to here and says eventually boomers who own their own homes by the tens of millions are going to want to sell their homes. Well, to whom are they going to sell their homes? The generations behind them are a lot smaller, the next generation, Gen X, but they're kind of tagging along the same age cohort as the boomers. And that just doesn't make any sense whatsoever, because there's a generation difference. And for him to say they're a lot smaller, I disagree with that too, because again, how families work. You have to have basically two parents, a mom and a dad, to make a babies. And if they're having two babies, when mom and dad age out and pass to the great beyond, they're replaced in the population count by two babies. So if we're talking about families being only two people, we may not see net growth, but we won't see a reduction. The next generation is not going to be smaller. It may be the same size. The only way you're going to have a smaller next generation is if the if the Gen Xers weren't being, born at a parallel rate to the rate that we are passing away. And we know we've at least exceeded that. I can pull you a population graph, and we can see the population of the United States is not going to get smaller. It's just nonsense. That's absolute nonsense. So we're going to go down. He basically says everybody's going to be wanting to sell their house at one time. Okay, well, we all have to have a place to live. Would you agree with that? Let's look at the logic. If baby boomers are selling out, until the time we go to the great beyond, they're going to live somewhere. Now, they may end up going into aged care, elder care, assisted living, and when they do, that's going to liberate a home. But then, because a Gen Xer then sells his home, he's not going to be homeless. He's going to move somewhere. So he's going to move into some other home, one of the others perhaps. So I don't know where he expects to see the gluts to come from, because we're going to have to get to the point where nobody wants to live outside the city, and we're going to see that's total rubbish too. Let's go back to the study. And he says, whoops, let me slide down. Let's see. All right. Then he says, then I also get into the geographic disparities. It's not going to be an issue so much in Tucson, Phoenix, and Denver, and some of the other growing metropolitan places. One thing growth does is sort of fix mistakes, and that is our bandwagon bias, because the urban model has been failing. And the cities have not been fixing. They've been going increasingly bankrupt and not able to support the number of people. And with COVID and the lockdowns and the restrictions, people will be net exiting these extremely rough run cities. They're going to leave places like Tucson and Detroit and New York and Portland and Chicago. They're going to leave those northern cities and fill southern cities. So we will have some regional effects. It says, in most metropolitan areas of this country, the supply of potential baby boomer sellers will vastly exceed the supply of people wanting to buy those houses because of a lack of growth. Again, that's a regional statement that is based upon his bandwagon bias that cities are great and people are going to want to stay there, and we know that they're not. High taxes are driving people out. Rona has driven people out just as quickly as we can. They're leaving these areas. That is a false statement, in my humble opinion. And well, let's go down there and see what he says about Corona anyway. Daily Wildcat. How has the pandemic affected any of the great senior short sale has any of it had an effect at all? And his answer is no, I would say not at all, because it's been too short. If the pandemic lasts 2 or 3 or 4 years, I don't know exactly what we're going to see. But on the one hand, some will say that they will push people into the rural areas for safety from COVID, but I don't think so, because even though you might be able to work from home, and even though you might want to be away from people, we're still social creatures. Now, I would agree with that. We're still social creatures, but we're still going to be near enough to people to socialize in some event, and this is going to be short-term situation. That's not true. The pandemic has taught many businesses that they don't need big real estate and that people can work from home. And they're going to force people to work from home, and we're not going to go into the cities. And that's another reason why the cities are going to be laid waste and they're going to end up being barren. And particularly the ones that were abusive to their citizens, such as Portland, Seattle, LA, New York, Newark, and so on. They're going to leave these large urban cities in the north and move south and move to lower areas. Atlanta may see some move out to the suburbs, but we're going to see people move out away from the conflict and violence, looting and burning, and all the stuff that he's ignoring. Because he has what? An affinity bias. He has also a bandwagon bias, and he's ignoring, this is an anchor bias, he's ignoring the fact that the facts have changed since he probably started his study, which is the other type of bias, one of the other type of bias. And we have a confirmation bias. He wants to believe what he wants to believe. Now let's hit a quick recap. Now, we started out with the affinity bias with the Cornell University graduate in religious studies, and we show that he has connections to the redistributionist policy people, and he is, if you remember, I said, I think the liberal left tends to be negative as opposed to a positive, and we even mentioned a new type of bias, cognitive bias, the Baader-Meinhof, or the frequency bias, where if you go around looking for new Corvettes, you're going to find Corvettes. If you're looking for social injustice, you're going to find more social injustice. If you find glass ceilings and all the other things that they think they need fixing, they're going to find it turns out to be a negative kind of mindset. And as a result, that's my opinion, we see that the young man believes in the very first article that millennials will not be able to buy a home. They'll be priced out. Now, the professor we saw when we were talking about the bandwagon is working on 15-year-old data where everybody loves the city and Corona doesn't matter because it's too short and it's going to have to be 3 years to make any difference whatsoever. He said that we're going to have a great senior sell-off and we're going to have a glut of unsellable homes that nobody wants to buy. Well, can you tell me how those two fairly leftist, liberal ideas coexist? If we're truly objective looking at facts, how does that happen that we have millennials who can't afford to buy a house and a glut of houses as we have too many of them in the country? We're going to find houses. It all settles out. So those two things don't work, and neither one of them are particularly positive. One of them has people not be able to buy homes. The others have people not be able to sell homes. They're both, I think, fairly negative. Now we can look for something a little more positive, and let's look at the first. Well, the first one said that we'll never get over 30%. The second one we looked at, NBC, said they'd hit 51% of the market in mortgages this year, and both of those were at first of the year. We looked at post-Rona numbers with the professor who's still having his anchor bias, where he ignores the fact that our tastes change when significant features of our life are modified, such as we can't go away from home because we're locked in like jailbirds in a city and we can't go out. These northern cities that have been looted and burning are having a permanent change to people's psyches, and people who can afford to are going to leave. You can bet your bottom dollar the ones who can afford to are going to leave those large urban areas and are going to move to safer zones out in the country. Let's see if we can find some data that will support that. Maybe that is a confirmation bias, and I'm just going to go find something that supports what I want to believe. Let's go see if we can check that out. Let's look over here at this story. At Realtor.com says, Millennials help power this year's housing market rebound. And that's what the NBC article said, that millennials were taking over 51% of the market. And I think we can just kind of glance through this to save some time. Demand from millennials who today range from their mid-20s to late 30s have been increasingly important in the housing market since at least the middle of the last decade. That's because they're the next generation of home buyer. But more recently, these new homeowners have pushed aside older generations to become even bigger influence. I thought the professor said that the millennials were a smaller generation and they didn't matter as much as the baby boomers. That's why we're going to have too many houses. Can't be right. I think he's got his bandwagon bias going for him. Now let's look a little further down. We anticipate as they turn 31 and 32 that we see home buying demand grow. The deputy chief economist for First American Financial Corp, millennials could be responsible for 15 million home sales in the next decade. And we go on down. I've got something highlighted. How about that? First-time home buyers accounted for 34% of home sales and 32% from the 32% earlier, the National Association of Realtors said. Now, Sandra Martinez, who's 32-year-old and lives in Las Vegas, said, we used to think she didn't want to buy a home. She preferred the freedom of picking up and moving. Now, what did we say about the professor's anchor bias using that 15-year-old data about people not wanting to be tied down to being a homeowner? He said they didn't want to do it. What is Miss Gonzalez telling us? She's telling us, who's 32 years old and lives in Las Vegas, used to think she didn't want to own a home. She preferred the freedom of being able to pick up and move. She preferred the freedom to be able to pick up and move, but when she started looking for a new place to rent in the beginning of the year, she realized that buying would be cheaper than renting in her neighborhood. So that's showing the good professor's anchor bias and his bandwagon. He's not willing to change what he believes, and he's stuck in his old way of thinking. Now, we're going to go on down, I think, to our next story. Yes, let's go to our next story. Let's look at this one. We're going to check some biases. We're going to read this headline, and you tell me what comes to mind. The markets and economy, this is for Inman News. This also is an industry-related publication. The typical 2020 home seeker, a millennial woman who wants more space. A new report from Point2 found that that searches for houses have exploded post-lockdown, and women are doing most of the house hunting. And it comes down here, who's looking for a home in 2020? According to the report from the listing site Point2, the typical U.S. home seeker this year is a millennial woman looking for more space and outdoor features, and she's willing to pay for it. Now let's go right there. What did it say? Does it say that women are buying more homes? Well, no, that might be an affinity bias. That might be a perception bias. It just says that they're doing more shopping. And a little bit later, we're going to find out it's not really that much more than the males. It says they're 55%. But it says they're looking for, and they're saying, what are they looking for? More space. So Mr. Professor, with his September 1st interview and his anchor bias and his bandwagon bias, is unwilling to change his mind from what he already believes, and he's not willing to accept the demographics, and he's not willing to accept the effect that Rona has on the population. And what does the industry show? That the typical home buyer right now is going to be looking, the shopper is ladies looking for more space and more room. And why are they going to need more space and more room? Let's go back to our article. And here's that number. Point two found that 55% of home shoppers were women, and the largest age group was 25 to 34. Is that a baby boomer? Don't believe it's a baby boomer. And it says that followed closely by the 55 to 64 group, and that would be a baby boomer, at 19.7%. 71% of the users did their browsing on smartphone. Well, ladies do like their gadgets more so than men do. Men are not quite as much, sound sexist, but women do lean heavier on the electronics. They tend to be more social on Facebook, and I think it's on Instagram. Pinterest, I think, is 97%, or it's 87, 97. Huge percent is almost all ladies on Pinterest. And it just varies depending on the type of multimedia, social media that we look at. And point two found that the ladies are doing the shopping. And let's see what they're looking for and see how it compares to the September report from the university professor. It says that in terms of priorities, post-lockdown home shoppers are less interested in the usual granite countertops and stainless steel appliances than they are the square footage and number of bedrooms. And here's a taste change for builders. They're looking for less open floor plans and accessible outdoor amenities such as pools and gardens, according to the report. They become more interested in houses at the expense of condos and land, and start looking at higher price range, looking for 200 to 300,000 range and 500 to 7,000. What did the professors outdated bandwagon? This is the way everybody agrees we want to live in the cities. The data doesn't show that. He's biased. He's giving a wrong idea, and he's anchored in his established belief. What is the data actually telling us they want? People want more space, and they want more rooms, because the implication of this is going to be because they need the room to set up their post-corona in-home businesses, because we're not likely to go back to get into the city. And we have some nice little data, and it just shows some slight shifts in the numbers, and that's pretty typical. We would expect short term. And it says, point two also found evidence that after being cooped up at home with children and significant others, home buyers have realized they need more personal space and are eschewing in pre-pandemic preferences for open plan rooms. Well, it's just the corona has upset all of that old, outdated information, and it's saying that I'm telling you that the baby boomers are not going to have houses that nobody wants to buy. And something I haven't shown you in this is the coronavirus has caused the cost of lumber to skyrocket by about 8 to 10% on the build, just to build a new home. So these older existing baby boomer homes are going to be better positioned as existing homes over newer homes, because the cost of what it's going to cost to build a new home on a typical lot. The ladies are able to find an older home with maybe some more rooms, able to kind of get away from folks to run the business and all that, and that's not fitting in with that anchored biased data, and it's not fitting in with that bandwagon data. And it doesn't fit with their confirmation bias that we're going to find what we want to see. I don't have a preference. I don't care. You tell me what you want to buy, I'll find it for you. We'll look. We'll find what you want. And it's going to be a great market for people who want to sell their homes. Let's see if I have one more that we want to look at, or if we can cut it off right here. Well, what do you say we recap this? I've got one more picture I want to show you, and it kind of falls into that whole, I really don't know. I don't know what that professor was talking about. And again, I don't have a PhD. I got a lot of degrees, but none of them are PhDs, and I'm not there in that environment. But here's a chart. And in this chart, We see the very lowest level, that kind of lightest yellow, are people too young to kind of go into the home buying market. They're 1992 to 2012. They're still fairly young, and the one right immediately above it is the silent generation. Those are aging out, and they're not buying that many homes. And of course, the very next one is the baby boomers. We got the bulk of that, but we're going to be maturing out and finding the answers to the great mysteries of life. And as that goes on, you see we're not quite ready for the Gen Xers, which is the up to 1980, but the 81s to 96, the Millennials, they're taking off. They're getting it. So that's our little market. And if we go right back to finishing up, we've covered 4 biases. They're cognitive biases, and the Baader-Meinhof, which is the frequency bias. There are a lot of different ways to bias to shift your information, your conclusions that you have. And if I look at the first one we started with was the affinity bias, the bubble bias. I want to be around people like me, and I want to surround myself with people like me. That way we don't have disagreements. Everybody is like me. We all get along and everything's fine. And along with that particular bias is the bandwagon bias. Is very similar, except that we've elevated someone as being an influencer, and we want to be like them. And if they tell us that's what they do and that's cool, we want to do that too, to be cool. But it's very similar to the affinity, because we still want to be associated with a group, instead of one's a group and one's a kind of a person or a particular influence. And it doesn't have to be a person. It can be like an ideology or a movement. It can be a political party. I want to be with a political party because that's where all the cool people are. It's affinity and the bandwagon, very, very close to the same. Anchor bias, that's the don't confuse me with the facts. My mind's made up. When I learn something, I don't want to learn something different. Think about the mask issues. Anything else. Once you learn something, whether it's a right learning or incorrect learning, it's programmed in. It takes you 10 times to get something out of your head than it does just about. That's a figure of speech, but it takes a lot more effort to get something out of your brain that you put in there than it did to put it in. And the last one, of course, is the cognitive bias, which just says the cognitive bias of the confirmation, which is, if I want to prove that Harley-Davidsons are the best motorcycles, I'm going to go out and find me some data that proves that Harley-Davidson are the best motorcycles and all the rest of them stink. Now, if I happen to be a Europhile, I might want to go out and find that BMWs are the best. So it's just a point of confirmation bias is you're actually rejecting other information because you don't want to upset. And all of these biases are the same thing. We don't want to be upset. We don't want the facts to bother us. In one form or the other, we don't want the facts to bother us. And that's where bias can be a problem. If you recognize you have a bias, you can kind of plan around it. I like to grab a lot of information from different sources and trust none of it. Just question all of it. That's just me. It's late at night. We're going to produce this and put this in the morning, and you'll see it soon. Thank you for watching. I'm sorry it's so long, but it's kind of difficult to go through biases and then show you examples of it.